Trapped in the shadows, my escape from a cult. I was 15 when I was kidnapped. I remember sneaking out of my house after another fight with my parents. Rebellious and stubborn, I didn't think twice about the dangers of wandering around at night. I was angry and just wanted to clear my head. But that night, my life changed forever. A van pulled up beside me. Before I knew what was happening, two men grabbed me, covering my mouth and dragging me inside. I fought, kicked, and screamed, but it was no use. They tied me up and drove for what felt like hours. When the van finally stopped, I was dragged into a massive building surrounded by high barricades. I'd never see the outside world again for the next 6 years. The place was eerie. It was designed like a self-sustaining community with sleeping quarters, dining halls, and even recreation rooms. At first, I thought it might be some kind of underground prison, but I soon learned it was worse. Much worse. This wasn't just a place, it was a cult. The leader called himself Father Elijah, a self-proclaimed prophet who claimed to have divine visions about an impending uprising. He was charismatic, with a voice that could command a room, and he had an almost hypnotic hold over his followers. They worshipped him, gave him their money, and obeyed his every word. His teachings were bizarre, a mix of apocalyptic predictions and promises of salvation. He claimed only those who stayed within the compound and followed his rituals would survive. Stepping outside was forbidden. He preached that the outside world was infected, tainted by sin, and anyone who left would bring ruin upon the rest. Life inside the compound was a blend of monotony and fear. Each day began with mandatory prayers led by Father Elijah, where he would deliver impassioned sermons about the uprising and the importance of loyalty. Meals were communal, eaten in silence under the watchful eyes of guards. The compound was sprawling, with activity areas designed to keep us busy and distracted. There were workshops where we made crafts, supposedly for sale in the factory, and gardens where we grew food. But every part of it felt like a calculated strategy to keep us occupied and docile. Punishments loomed over everything. Even a minor infraction, like speaking out of turn, could land someone in the Room of Atonement. I'd hear the screams late at night, echoing through the halls, and see the broken people who emerged. Some bore scars on their backs, others walked with limps. There was no way to know what went on in there, but the threat of it was enough to keep most people in line. I learned early on that playing the part of an obedient member was the only way to survive. I attended every prayer, worked diligently in the workshops, and kept my head down. But I was always watching, always listening. My rebellious nature didn't disappear, it just went underground. I began to memorize the layout of the compound, noting which doors were locked and where the guards stationed themselves. I paid attention to their shifts, watching for patterns and weaknesses. One of the few places where I found any solace was the air duct system. I'd grown up watching my dad fix air conditioning units, and I knew how to navigate them. Late at night, when the compound was quiet, I'd crawl into the ducts and explore. From there, I could overhear conversations and piece together information. That's how I learned about the sacrifices. Every month, someone disappeared, usually a woman, but sometimes a man. Father Elijah called it a sacred offering to prepare for the uprising. The idea terrified me, but I pushed it to the back of my mind. Then, one night, I overheard two members of the inner circle talking. They were discussing the next sacrifice. It was me. Panic set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't let them see any change in my behavior. Over the next few weeks, I began to refine my escape plan. I studied the guards' routines more closely, noting when they were most distracted. I mapped out the air ducts and identified which ones led to critical areas like the electrical control room and the underground tunnel. The tunnel was the only way out. It led to the outside world, but it was heavily guarded and disguised as part of the factory's infrastructure. I needed a way to get past the guards and out of the building without raising suspicion. Disguising myself as one of them was the only option. Stealing a uniform was the first challenge. I waited until one of the guards left his jacket unattended during a meal and snatched it when no one was looking. Then, I began observing their behavior more closely, mimicking the way they walked and spoke. It was risky. If anyone caught on, I'd be sent to the Room of Atonement, but I had no choice. The second challenge was timing. I needed to create a distraction big enough to draw attention away from the tunnel. That's where the electrical control room came in. I discovered it during one of my nighttime explorations and realized that cutting the power would plunge the compound into chaos. It would also disable the security cameras, giving me a window to escape. The night of the escape was the most terrifying of my life. I waited until the compound was quiet, then crawled through the ducts to the control room. My hands shook as I pulled the lever to cut the power. The lights went out, and alarms began to blare. I quickly changed into the stolen guard's uniform and made my way to the tunnel, blending in with the confusion. When I reached the tunnel entrance, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. I nodded to the guard stationed there, trying to look calm. "Backup generators down," I muttered, hoping they wouldn't question me. To my relief, they waved me through. The tunnel was long and dark, with only faint emergency lights to guide the way. Every step felt like an eternity. When I finally emerged into the cold night air, I almost collapsed. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the stars I hadn't seen in 6 years. But I couldn't stay. I ran, not knowing where I was or where to go. The compound was in the middle of an industrial area, surrounded by factories. I wandered for hours until I found a truck driver who took pity on me and drove me to the nearest town. The next 6 months were a blur. Without sunlight for so long, my skin was pale and damaged. I couldn't adjust to the outside climate and spent weeks in the hospital. Therapy sessions became a regular part of my life as I struggled to process what had happened. The hospital staff contacted the authorities, and soon, law enforcement was involved. The FBI launched an investigation into the cult, but it took time to gather enough evidence for a raid. My memories of the cult haunted me. Every night, I'd wake up drenched in sweat, hearing Father Elijah's voice echoing in my head. His promises of salvation, his warnings about the infected world outside, and his chilling threats all played on a loop in my mind. I doubted myself sometimes, wondering if I really was safe or if the world outside was as corrupted as he had claimed. It wasn't just physical recovery I needed, it was mental and emotional healing, too. When the SWAT team finally stormed the compound, they found dozens of captives. Some were so brainwashed they refused to leave, clinging to Father Elijah's promises even as the police escorted them out. Others were too traumatized to speak. The scenes inside were horrifying. The Room of Atonement was filled with implements of torture. Hidden passageways led to burial sites where the remains of the sacrifices were discovered. The factory front had been laundering money from donations and illegal activities, funding Father Elijah's twisted empire. Despite the crackdown, the man who had stolen 6 years of my life remained at large. I'll add part 2 in the following message. Part 2, The Hunt. Years passed, but my escape from the compound was only the beginning. Father Elijah remained at large, a ghost haunting every corner of my life. His cult had splintered, his followers forming smaller, more secretive groups. Despite the raid, his influence persisted, spreading through underground networks and whispered messages online. For every survivor like me, there were dozens still trapped in the web of his lies. And as long as he was free, none of us could truly heal. I had tried to move on, throwing myself into therapy, advocacy work, and helping law enforcement track down remnants of the cult. Sharing my story wasn't just cathartic, it was a weapon against the man who had stolen 6 years of my life. The FBI relied on my knowledge of the compound's layout, routines, and Elijah's methods to locate other sites he might be using. But it wasn't enough. Elijah always seemed to stay one step ahead. Then came the whispers, rumors of a new sanctuary. Survivors and defectors spoke of a compound deep in the mountains, a fortress more secure and isolated than the last. It was there, they claimed, that Elijah was rebuilding his empire. The FBI was skeptical at first, wary of false leads, but I recognized the patterns. The rituals, the terminology, the signs, it all pointed to him. That's when they approached me with a proposition, to go undercover. The idea was insane. I had spent years trying to distance myself from the cult, to strip away the fear and control Elijah had instilled in me. Now they wanted me to step back into that world, to put myself at risk. But deep down, I knew I couldn't say no. I wasn't just a victim anymore, I was a survivor, and if there was even a chance I could help bring him down, I had to try. The preparation was grueling. I was coached on how to infiltrate the group, given a new identity, and trained to withstand psychological manipulation. They taught me how to plant listening devices, signal for extraction, and stay grounded in my own reality. But nothing could have prepared me for the moment I stepped into that new compound. It was both familiar and alien. The architecture was different, more rustic, with log cabins and open fields, but the atmosphere was the same. The chanting, the oppressive rules, the unshakable devotion to Elijah, all of it transported me back to my years of captivity. And then, there he was. Older, with more gray in his beard and lines on his face, but still the same piercing eyes and magnetic voice. Father Elijah. He didn't recognize me, of course. I was just another lost soul seeking salvation, another pawn to mold. I played my part well, pretending to be enthralled by his sermons and eager to prove my loyalty. Every day, I walked a tightrope, gathering intel while avoiding suspicion. The smallest mistake could have meant exposure, and Elijah's punishments were as brutal as ever. The Room of Atonement was still in use, and the screams at night were a grim reminder of what was at stake. Over weeks, I pieced together the structure of the new compound. I mapped the security measures, noted the escape routes, and identified the key members of Elijah's inner circle. But the real breakthrough came when I overheard a conversation about the revelation. It was a planned event, a mass sacrifice of his followers to cleanse the world before the uprising. The scale of it was horrifying, and the timing was imminent. If we didn't act fast, countless lives would be lost. I smuggled the information out through coded messages, and the FBI sprang into action. A raid was planned, but it had to be perfectly timed. If Elijah got even a hint of what was coming, he would vanish again, leaving destruction in his wake. The night of the raid was chaos. Armed agents stormed the compound, their shouts mingling with the panicked cries of cult members. Explosions and gunfire tore through the air as Elijah's guards fought back. I had stayed in character until the last possible moment, guiding vulnerable members to safety while secretly signaling the agents to Elijah's location. I found him in the main hall, surrounded by his most loyal followers. He was shouting commands, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw a flicker of recognition. His face twisted in rage and disbelief. "You," he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "You betrayed me." But this time, I wasn't afraid. I stood my ground as the agents swarmed in, taking him into custody. His followers screamed and cried, some trying to protect him, others turning on him in confusion. As he was dragged away in handcuffs, he spat threats at me, promising that his mission wasn't over, that he would rise again. But his words no longer had power over me. In the days that followed, the extent of his crimes came to light. The new compound had been a hub for human trafficking, financial scams, and violent indoctrination. Dozens of survivors were rescued, though many were too traumatized to speak. Elijah's arrest sent shockwaves through the remnants of his cult, fracturing their networks and weakening their influence. For the first time in years, it felt like the nightmare was truly over. I still bear the scars of my time in the cult, both physical and emotional. But I've learned to see them not as marks of weakness, but as symbols of survival. I escaped. I fought back. And I won. Elijah is behind bars, and while the fight against his legacy continues, I know I've done my part. The world can be a dark place, full of people like him who prey on the vulnerable. But it's also full of resilience, courage, and the power to overcome. I found that power within myself, and I'll spend the rest of my life helping others find it, too.